Ann Eberhardt of Grant Thornton, and she will be speaking on governance, risk, and compliance. If anyone has any questions during the course of the presentation, you can put them into the questions function on your side toolbar, and we will save those all until the end of the presentation for our Q&A session. We also have a survey that we're going to have everyone try to fill out at the end of the presentation. It takes about 20 seconds, but it's very helpful for us to better our webinars for you. So with that, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Ann and let her get started.
Terrific. Thank you, Justin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ann Eberhardt, and I'm a Senior Manager in the Forensic Investigations and Dispute Services Practice at Grant Thornton, New York City. I'm a member of the firm's Anti-Corruption and Anti-Money Laundering Task Force, and I have spent a significant portion of my career performing investigations and controls assessments for financial institutions, pharmaceutical companies, international nonprofits, and government bodies. I've also cultivated a reputation in the firm as someone who will go absolutely anywhere. And so my firm has rewarded me with the opportunity to work in some of the most dangerous circumstances. I've worked in northern Pakistan from a tent in an earthquake zone, in Iraq during the surge for 10 months in 2008, in post-war Serbia, in Ukraine, as well as in Mexico. So I have a taste for adventure. I hope today in our discussion that we'll be able to have a fruitful discussion, that we'll be able to discuss some issues that are important to you. So to get us started, let's talk about governance, risk, and compliance.
So before we get the presentation started, we just want to put up a quick polling question so that we can get a little bit of an idea of where the audience stands on this topic. So the question that we're asking is, how knowledgeable are you on the topics of governance, risk, and compliance? What we're going to do is just have everyone take a quick moment to click and on which response will sort of go with them. We'll leave the polling open for another probably 5 or 10 seconds or so. We have a good amount of people who have already answered the polling question. We'll also be able to share the results with you in real time. All right, so we're going to close the polling question right now, and I'll share the results with everyone. So we have 11% with no knowledge on the topics of governance, risk, and compliance, 32% with limited knowledge, 47% with average knowledge, and 11% with advanced knowledge. So now I'm going to pass it back over to Ann.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
It'll show.
Okay. When we talk about governance, I like to think of governance as that overall set of strategies and organizations that organizations use to protect themselves from the risks that they face. And I think of it as a structure. And that structure comes with the complete set of policies and procedures that the organization uses at its base to improve its governance practices. It includes the audit function, and by the audit I mean both the internal and external audit functions. It also includes all the oversight committees that the organization has in place. Frequently that means the board of directors, but any other sort of committees that do their part to oversee governance and compliance for an organization. Also as a part of this, we will include the surveillance tactics that an organization uses to monitor its governance and its compliance. And the most important part of this structure is the tone at the top. No matter what the organization does, if it doesn't have a coherent front that it presents to the members of its organization with respect to the attitudes for the risks it faces, there will be problems within the organization. By risk, let's talk about what we mean by that. Every organization faces its own set of risks according to the activities it conducts. There's a small wine shop across the street from my office that I look at every day. that organization faces risks, and those risks are very different from the risks that a very large oil company operating in the Middle East would face. So there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all approach to governance. It's all based on the risks that each individual organization faces. So some of the most common risks that organizations face are fraud. And by fraud, I mean a number of things. Most people think of theft when they think of fraud. This is when the organization itself is a victim of fraud, when either someone within the organization takes assets from the company or someone from outside the organization steals. But by fraud, I'm also including in that definition, and we'll go into these quite a bit a little later, financial statement fraud, or the risk that the organization itself is perpetrating a fraud. And we'll also talk about corruption in this matter when we mean, usually we mean by that bribery, but we mean a couple of things with that. But fraud is kind of the broad topic we mean by those sorts of risks that an organization faces. And a lot of the governance structure is set up to protect organizations from fraud. Fraud, or all organizations also face litigation risks. You can be sued by pretty much anyone, whether it's your customers, your business partners, employees, other third parties, or government. Litigation is kind of an ever-present risk that all organizations face. Regulator action is one that we'll spend a considerable amount of time speaking about today. Regulators are going after organizations for compliance under the regulatory regime in which they operate at kind of a staggering pace these days. And so how an organization protects itself in the case of a potential regulator action is becoming an ever more important topic in any organization's governance, risk, and compliance order. Data breaches. I'm sure everyone's been hearing the headlines these days. Again, what are your risks of a data breach? What are your compliance obligations in case you or your organization faces a data breach? This is becoming a vexing problem for every organization. And then what some people are beginning to refer to as A1C1 risk. This is the risk that your organization appears either on the front page of a newspaper or the front page of the business section. Again, no one wants bad publicity for their organization. By compliance, again, this is a topic that almost every organization has some sort of compliance burden. So as we kind of channel our discussion into compliance, we think of this as being the regime you have in place to make sure your SEC filings, for example, if you're subject to SEC regulator rules, that those filings are prepared appropriately. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or the FCPA, we'll go into that in a considerable amount of detail later in this presentation. Compliance with laws governing insider trading. Third parties, what are your obligations to comply with new rules involving your relationships with third parties? What are your obligations involving cybersecurity, trade controls, conflict minerals, anti-money laundering? The list goes on. I haven't even touched on even close to all that there is, but these form the framework of what we will discuss in today's presentation. So what are the challenges that you face that, in managing your governance, risk, and compliance structure? I think what is becoming clear is we are in a supercharged regulatory environment. I was in a seminar the other day where that was the exact phrase that the lawyer leading the discussion said. This is truly a different time. Regulators are using unprecedented tactics and unprecedented ambition for going after organizations. So do not underestimate the risks that you face with meeting your regulatory compliance. Another challenge organizations face is, how to build and maintain a robust infrastructure. It's expensive. It's expensive not to build one. What's the right structure? These are the questions that every organization must answer in addressing its overall governance, risk and compliance strategy. Other challenges are, what do you do when there's a problem? How do you manage those breaches? What are your duties and obligations if a fraud is discovered or if corruption is discovered, or if there's a data, if the data becomes compromised within your organization? What should you do? Do you have a protocol in place? And then there's notice that I put the high cost of non-compliance. Building compliance structures, as I said, is expensive, but some of the staggering fines that have been coming through, it's almost it's turned out that it's becoming much more expensive not to comply. So what are the compliance issues that keep you up at night? We have a polling question.
Yeah, guys, we have another polling question for you. We've sort of taken a couple of the ones that we feel are the biggest compliance issues, and we wanted to get your opinion on those. So the question is, which issue do you feel is the biggest compliance issue? The choices are corruption, third parties, cybercrime, insider trading, and trade controls. So if everyone could just take a couple of seconds and vote on this, that would be great. All right, we'll leave it open for a few more seconds to let everyone get their last votes in. All right, and then we'll close the poll and share the results. So we have 15% saying that corruption is the biggest compliance issue, 20% saying third parties, 30% saying cybercrime, 5% saying insider trading, and 30% saying trade control.
Okay, that's very helpful. Today, we've got most of the ones that I think that you're interested in. We'll talk about specifically corruption, third parties, insider trading, trade controls, whistleblowers, and cybercrime, and not necessarily in that order. Mm-hmm. By corruption, we mean bribes, kickbacks, and then specifically with respect to bribes, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act, and the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act of Canada that was recently passed. The record fines that have been making headlines over the past 6 or 7 years have caught everyone's attention by now, I'm sure. And the word from the regulators is it's not over. Actually, I read a headline on the train on the way here about a pharmaceutical company that's now facing a big investigation for kickbacks that were paid to U.S. physicians. So kickbacks, I think, are on the rise as of an area that organizations need to be concerned about protecting themselves against as well. Bribes, just to remind everyone, are illegal everywhere, both domestically and in foreign countries. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act rules and regulations, while they're frequently the headline grabbers, it's also important to remember that it's illegal to bribe anyone in the United States as well. I'm going to, I think it's worth repeating that with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the two provisions that most companies are investigated for. The first is the anti-bribery provision, which states that U.S. organizations and citizens, foreign companies listed on the U.S. stock exchange, and any person acting while in the United States is prohibited from paying or offering to pay directly or indirectly money or anything of value to a foreign official to obtain or retain business. That's a pretty broad definition, and you can be sure that the Justice Department and the SEC are extremely vigilant in and becoming more expansive in their definitions of what constitutes each of those definitions. So, for example, a German company was accused of bribing public officials in Argentina. They became subject to to this date, the biggest single fine and penalty for an FCPA violation, simply because they traded on the U.S. stock exchange. What is something of value? It might be a suitcase full of cash or a wire to a Swiss bank account, but more and more it can be something that looks like a donation to a favorite NGO, even elaborate travel accommodations for a spouse or another family member to conferences are now being, considered possibly something of value. And, what is the definition of a foreign official? In the past, you might have thought that was like the president or a high-ranking cabinet member of a country, but in many cases it can be physicians in a country that has a nationalized health system, and that's pretty much every country. So physicians in Mexico or in the UK are also considered public officials. The other important part of the FCPA is the books and records and internal controls provision. So any SEC registrar must keep books and records that accurately reflect business transactions, and they must maintain effective internal controls. The important point of this is that it's illegal for a company to have two sets of books. One of my colleagues was in Russia investigating violations of the FCPA. He asked one of the employees for a copy of the general ledger, and completely innocently, the employee asked him whether he wanted the regular ledger or the one that was used for paying bribes. So it was kind of a funny story, but that was obviously a clear violation of the books and records provision of the FCPA. Not only is it illegal to pay bribes, it's illegal to record the payment of a bribe as something other than the payment of a bribe. So that's part of the way that if we can't prove, if the government is unable to prove the bribery happened, they may be able to demonstrate that the books and records simply don't tell the full picture. And organizations have more frequently been fined and penalized for their failures under the books and records and internal controls provisions. Talk a little bit about trade controls. I noticed this is a hot topic for almost everyone on this seminar. The trade controls, there's an increasing use of post-clearance audits internationally as well as domestically, that organizations need to be prepared to provide their compliance structures to the regulators in this matter. So all of the controls that we talk about later apply to this type of compliance as well. Again, building the compliance structures are what enable you as an organization to be prepared when the regulator comes knocking on your door. I think compliance and trade controls is especially difficult because of all the jurisdictions most organizations are involved in. And not only are there state rules and regulations, but internationally, the rules can be extremely complex. In all jurisdictions control revenue collection, which of course is the whole point of customs. But there are rules governing prohibited trade. And those, can be weapons systems or software. It can also include counterparties. So, I'm sure most people realize on this call today that it's illegal to conduct business with Iran and North Korea and ISIS and Los Zetas in Mexico. But it can even include purchasing crude oil from Iraqi Kurdistan, and keeping track of all of those regulations and rules is a pretty complex task for any organization. Obviously, there are arcane rules in certain nations governing the protection of cultural heritage. I had a kind of funny story when I was leaving Ukraine a few years ago. I had picked up what I considered to be a relatively small item of a leftover from the former Soviet Union. I picked it up at a bazaar on the street, and Ukraine has pretty stiff regulations for not trafficking in cultural treasures. So as I was leaving the country, they asked me if I had any cultural treasures from Ukraine, and I said no, I did not. And then they scanned my bags, and lo and behold, they discovered this item in my bag and demanded that I take it out, and they actually didn't let me leave the country without it. I thought it was a little strange that a little bit of Soviet Union history would have been considered a part of Ukraine's cultural heritage, but they certainly considered it, a part of that regulation. So, again, as I said, the rules are pretty arcane. Also, multiple jurisdictions have, very difficult rules governing intellectual property, privacy, environmental protection. Again, keeping track of all of the rules that your organization is subject to is an extremely, extremely difficult task. A lot of what we're talking about with respect to corruption, trade controls, anti-money laundering, it actually has to do with third parties, and that's why we've decided to kind of talk about this a little bit separately. Regulators are expecting that entities make sure that the third parties they deal with are reputable, and that if problems arise, that they have access to the records of the third parties. So you'll more and more, a contract with a third party isn't just a contract with a third party. You have to do some due diligence on your part, and you also might need to put into your contract with your third party the right to audit. This is especially relevant in anti-corruption cases. It's becoming, unfortunately, more and more common around the world for companies to contract with third parties to sort of outsource their bribery function, which is, of course, illegal. But investigators are looking at these kinds of contracts more and more. I was involved in an investigation involving an international pharmaceutical company that had a very large operation in a Latin American country. There were whistleblower allegations that the company had made payments to entice certain key opinion leading physicians who were employees of the government to prescribe a particular drug that this company manufactured. But instead of making the payments directly to the physicians, the company offered significant discounts to the distributor of the drug. And so it was the distributor, which was not subject to the FCPA, that made the payments to the physicians. Now, the Justice Department wasn't persuaded by any of this. They insisted that, well, first of all, that there was a whistleblower allegation that turned out to be true. There were some very large discounts offered to this particular distributor, so there was definitely evidence that the whistleblower's allegations were true. And so far, the case is ongoing, but the regulators have shown no mercy whatsoever to our client. And at the moment, they're demanding that all the profits from the sale of this product be disgorged. We're still in negotiations on that, but they consider every sale of that product since it was developed to have been illegally obtained through the bribery actions of this third party. I don't know how many know on this call what OFAC-SDN stands for, so I will define it at the risk of insulting those of you who do know what it means. But the Treasury Department keeps a list, and under the Office of Foreign Assets Control of specially designated nationals. And these are the individuals and entities that are subject to economic sanctions by the U.S. It includes individuals who are suspected drug traffickers, also terrorists and war criminals. Banks especially are affected by these regulations. So if you're a financial institution, by definition, you are not allowed to have transactions going through your bank that are made to anybody on this list. And so, some fairly sophisticated software providers have developed some systems for organizations to run any transaction against this OFAC-SDN list to be sure that no transaction is directly going to such a person. The fines and penalties on violations of this have been, headline making. Banks have been fined in the last couple of years staggering amounts of money. One bank was fined $9 billion with a B, for sanctions violations involving payments to Sudan, Iran, and Cuba. I've made a list of several banks. I won't name them, but they're in the hundreds of millions up to the billions of fines and penalties. All of them, interestingly, involve at least payments to Iran. Iran, Sudan, Cuba, Burma, Libya. And I think the larger penalties that you're seeing have come because these financial institutions have taken proactive measures offshore to remove data so that by the time it comes to the United States, the data has actually been changed and manipulated to hide the transaction that has occurred with or to hide the source of the illegal transaction. So the regulators are becoming more and more savvy at being able to detect these kinds of violations, and the fines and penalties speak for themselves. They're not playing around here. They do intend to punish organizations who violate these rules. Another big headline grabber are the anti-money laundering, know your customer rules. These especially grew out of the post-9/11 USA Patriot Act rules. But every bank is required, or every financial institution is required to know who it's doing business with. And the definition of who is a customer is not necessarily someone who holds an account at your bank. While at the moment, most of these anti-money laundering KYC rules are targeted towards financial institutions, the money laundering has become very sophisticated and involves not only financial institutions but and money services businesses, but also even stores like jewelry stores, and even organizations some criminal organizations are starting to use trade-based anti-money laundering, using high-value goods that they're trading across borders that can be liquidated easily for cash once they cross into the into the country that's where they're trying to launder the money. So I think you will see that the anti-money laundering rules will expand to affect organizations that are not just financial institutions, especially if you're involved in a commodity or a trade type of business that involves high value goods. Look for some expectation from the regulators that you show that you know that your products are not being used to launder money. Again, the regulators are serious about chasing these kinds of crimes, and they have greater and greater access to data mining and data processing techniques to find the counterparties of these kinds of transactions. Trade partners are also a third party that that you need to do your due diligence on and be careful of who you're doing business with. My organization actually refuses to, my organization, which is an accounting company, does a background check on every customer that we engage. We want to be sure that we are doing business with companies that are reputable and that individuals don't have criminal backgrounds that we're doing business with. More and more, again, organizations are being held accountable for those with whom they conduct trade, and it's becoming a bigger deal for you to do your due diligence on those entities. So we talked a little bit about the due diligence, meaning by due diligence, background checks. But also, you need to, organizations need to be monitoring their transactions with third parties. If you're a bank and you're doing transactions with Anne, and Anne's transactions are pretty simple. She has a paycheck that arrives in her bank account every every couple of weeks, and then there's going to be there might be some expense reimbursements that come in periodically. But if suddenly, a really large sum of money lands in my account, then, the bank, if they know who Anne is and they know who they're doing business with, they're going to question that transaction. And they're going to do that because they're being held accountable by their regulators to do that. So monitoring third-party transactions is becoming an extremely important part of every organization's compliance regime. This is also important for my pharmaceutical company down in Latin America, that all the third parties it does business with, it knows the exact nature of the business it's doing, so that when the regulator starts asking them, well, why does this particular person have $15,000 going to her every month? What does she do? What is her role? Because that sort of looks like she might be being paid a bribe. And so if the company says, no, here's your contract, this is the set of services she provides for us, she's highly qualified to do this, this is the reason, then the regulator can say, okay, that particular transaction, while looking suspicious, is well justified. Most risk mitigation systems involving third parties involve a technology solution. Another important component of the risk and compliance of any organization is to make sure that these models are operating as they're expected to operate. Again, last year I was involved in an exercise with an international bank. I was testing their anti-money laundering software. And they had selected a software package that offered a number of profiles that they could flag every transaction against to see, where their money laundering risks were coming, and then they could examine transactions and either open cases or close them. And if they opened cases, they were ultimately supposed to lead to a suspicious activity report. So we developed our own strategy to mimic the transaction flagging process and tested to see whether the software system captured the same transactions we did. And I would have thought that that would be a pretty plug-and-play operation, but it turned out that there were quite a few lapses, and one of their profiles was completely broken. It was flagging transactions that were well below their threshold, and not flagging transactions that were well above the threshold. So again, a regulator is not going to say, oh, well, that's the fault of your vendor. They're going to say, no, it's your fault because you didn't validate the model. So be aware that that is becoming, again, an increasingly difficult part of the whole compliance structure of an organization. Let's talk a little about cybercrime. This is one of those nightmare areas that it's almost overwhelming. You know, what do you do? The breaches are just coming at a staggering pace. I think they did an episode on 60 Minutes the other night. In 2014, more than 60% of all entities reported at least one successful cyber attack. The record numbers of data, record volumes of data that are being taken, and you've seen the headlines. I won't repeat the names of the organizations, but these have not only cost billions of dollars, but they're causing huge amounts of reputational damage to entities, and causing people to rethink how they conduct their business online. And most compliance officers have not even thought that this was their issue until an event occurs. And even more frightening is that sometimes the company itself doesn't even know that it's happening. And what are the cyber thieves taking? I mean, they may be taking your secrets. They may be taking the secrets of your customers or of your employees. If you're a healthcare provider, the healthcare records they're taking can cause all sorts of compliance issues for you. We'll talk about some of the sanctions we've been seeing there in a couple of minutes. Data transfers that are cross-border can cause you all sorts of issues. Are there violations, of international laws now suddenly that need to be considered? And what happens to your data once it's in the hands of a criminal gang, say in Chechnya, where you can't really get to them? These are all part of the nightmare of every compliance group in the world, practically. As I said, most data breaches that are not even detected internally. Usually they're informed, an organization is informed either by a credit card company that had a customer complaint, or perhaps by a reporter, or even a law enforcement agency. So it's truly scary. As this becomes, a bigger and bigger issue, the regulators are also starting to take more notice of this and to start to hold companies increasingly accountable. So look for compulsory reporting of cyber attacks, similar to a suspicious activity report that a bank is required to fill. I'm sure that is not far away from my discussions with regulators. Those are on the way. They're trying to figure out how to write those laws and regulations. But if you are an organization of any size or with a certain level of sensitivity of data and you're subject to a cyber attack, you probably in the next few years will have to report it to the government. There's kind of been there will also be increased accountability for the level of protection that you're offering within your organization. In Connecticut and one other state, attorneys general sued healthcare companies who were victims themselves of cyber attacks because they failed to protect medical records adequately. So even though they were the victims, they were held accountable. And on the heels of any sort of regulatory issue, there will be increased litigation as well. You can count on it. Look for that in the form of class action lawsuits on behalf of consumers who are affected. I want to talk a lot about insider trading. I don't think that there were a lot of people worried about that, but just kind of to go through that, there's an unprecedented use of quantitative analysis. Law enforcement is using this for insider trading, but also for all of the other areas we've talked about for compliance. So they have access to data. They're able to, they're contracting with some of the best software providers in the country, and they're able to look at data across industries and find patterns either of insider trading or anti-money laundering. I think they're looking to do that with cyber attacks, with healthcare fraud. So a lot of what we're talking about with insider trading also affects other areas of compliance as well. Whistleblowers, if they don't keep you up at night, they should. if you're in an organization that has experienced any form of if you're in an organization and you have a whistleblower report to crime, you have certain obligations. A, to provide that whistleblower an anonymous platform for reporting the crime, and then also they become protected by your organization. There, you cannot retaliate. And if you are seen to retaliate against that whistleblower, that in and of itself will bring sanctions down on the organization. The whistleblower provisions, especially under Dodd-Frank, have raised the bar substantially. The whistleblowers have a very short period of time before they, after they report internally, before they can, so that they can report to the government. So if they report internally, they have 120 days if the company doesn't act to go to the government. And the government is now offering substantial rewards for whistleblowers who bring actionable matters to their attention. And they've started to pay out some of those rewards. So one recently was for over $14 million. And now the SEC is reporting it's receiving more than 6,000 tips annually. So the incentives for whistleblowers to turn their companies in for violations or perceived violations has become huge. And not only is your organization at risk if it's actually doing something wrong, but it also has obligations once a whistleblower comes forward to act internally in a responsible way, both to protect the whistleblower as well as to investigate the whistleblower's allegations. So in April of 2012, the Justice Department declined to bring an enforcement action against Morgan Stanley in an FCPA case. Does anyone know why?
So what we are going to do is give you a couple of choices as to why. And you guys can fill in the choice that you think is correct. The choices we have are Morgan Stanley was determined to be too big to investigate. After an initial investigation, the Department of Justice determined there was not enough evidence to support a case. Because of the company's robust compliance program, regulators decided not to prosecute the case. Or the last choice is the evidence in the case was discovered to have been falsely presented by a whistleblower who was a disgruntled former employee. So if everyone could take a few seconds to vote, that would be great. This will be our last polling question of the presentation. All right, I'm going to give it a couple more seconds just to let the final people vote in here. All right, so we'll close the voting and share the results. We have 11% with choice 1, that Morgan Stanley was determined to be too big to investigate. 21% for choice 2, that after the initial investigation, the Department of Justice determined there was not enough evidence. 37% saying that they decided against prosecution because of the robust compliance program, and 32% saying that the evidence was found to be falsely represented by the whistleblower.
Great. Well, I'm glad people didn't just automatically know the answer. It looks like our answers were distributed fairly evenly around. But the correct answer is actually that Morgan Stanley was found to have had an adequate, in fact, a robust compliance structure in place. And so they declined to prosecute Morgan Stanley and instead went after the executive himself, who was recently sentenced. So I think the lesson here is that there are steps that you can take, and the regulators provided some guidance for building an appropriate governance structure. So let's have a little fun here. If you're building a governance structure, keeping in mind that first slide that we showed, Do you want it to be made of straw, sticks, or bricks? And I think the answer is pretty obvious that straws and sticks are just not going to cut it. It has to be made of bricks. But the important point is that there are all kinds of brick houses out there for your governance structure. Whether you know, my little wine store across the street from me needs a fairly modest governance structure, or you know, my oil company operating in the Middle East might need the node in the tower in the lower right-hand sort of structure for its governance structure. But the important point here is that that every organization must have a robust governance structure that's adequately addressing the particular risks that it faces. So thankfully, the regulators provided some guidance for us here, and this will take us to the end of our discussion, and we'll kind of go through these slides relatively quickly to give you a chance to answer some questions. But absolutely, board involvement has to be a part of the organizational or an effective compliance program. And as we talked about before, the tone at the top is absolutely essential. Senior leadership must demonstrate its commitment, and as some people have described it to me, some compliance officers, compliance must form part of the fabric of the organization. I liked that discussion, that description of it. The fabric of the organization must be to show that the organization is committed to compliance with the rules and regulations that it's subject to. As a part of the organizational structure, the compliance people must have their responsibilities articulated. You can't just say, well, oh, I thought that was sort of the general counsel's role, and you know, it's kind of her job to make sure that all this is taken care of. It needs to be in her job description, and she needs to know she's being held accountable for it. The organizational structure must have compliance spelled out in it at every level. And not only that, there needs to be a person who has access to the board without any layers of management in between him or her and the board, so that they can report any findings up to and including the CEO of the organization. There need to be enough resources devoted to the program. No regulator is going to say, oh, well, you said you didn't have enough budget for compliance. That's okay, we get it. No, you have to, in fact, organizations have been found, have been sanctioned for not devoting adequate resources to the compliance program. And the company must have approved standards and procedures designed to achieve and monitor compliance. These need to be approved by every important or every relevant level of management and the board. Employees must be trained. They have to know what is expected of them. So certain levels of employees don't really need to worry about violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but some employees, especially if they're operating in a foreign country, need to know. And they need to be trained in a language that makes sense to them. If you're in Mexico and you're offering your training in English, and most people don't really speak English that well, that's not considered effective training. An effective compliance program is going to have a confidential and anonymous disclosure mechanism, or what we call a hotline. That can be a website, it can be an 800 number, but there has to be a way for a whistleblower to make their findings known anonymously. Risk assessments have to be performed on the compliance program on a regular basis. There need to be incentives within the organization and for people to perform. You can't say, oh, we expect you to not bribe anybody, but you're in a country where everybody's being bribed, and if you don't get any sales, you're going to be fired. You have to align the incentives within the organization to help enforce the compliance that you expect of your organization. And conversely, if you find someone who's out of compliance, there need to be disciplinary measures so that there's a precedent that's being set. And all of this was present in the Morgan Stanley case. The person who committed the bribery was found to have received multiple notices for violating the firm's anti-bribery provisions. Also, it's not enough to just build a program and make it run forever. It needs to be evaluated and changed whenever, as either shortcomings are discovered or as circumstances change. It's now time for questions.
So with that, we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A session. If anyone does have any questions, you can feel free to put them into the questions tab, and I will pose them to Ann. The first question that we have is sort of a hypothetical question. If I have a credit application from a potential customer and I check the company and principal names against the OFAC-SDN list and later find out from the government that the company/principals were involved in terrorist activity, would the government consider that my company knew its customer?
I think that the simple answer to that is that if you can demonstrate that you took the step of checking it against the list and that the list was a valid list, and you found that that person was not on the list, that you had conducted an adequate level of due diligence. Keep in mind that an important part of that is documenting the steps you took or that you regularly take.
So if anyone does have any more questions, you guys can just feel free to put those into the questions function now. We've also had the question come in if we would be willing to email a copy of the presentation. We usually do email a copy, and that will go out to everyone either later today or first thing tomorrow, a PDF version of the presentation deck. All right, another question we have is, would it be a good idea to add a OFAC compliance to my credit policy?
My answer to that is it depends. It depends on your business. I think that most, if you're the wine store, for example, across the street from me in New York City, you probably don't need to worry about it that much. If you're doing business internationally, especially with individuals in high-risk countries, and high-risk countries include Mexico, then you probably should add it to your policy. So without knowing more about the nature of your business, I can't say definitively, but I think you have to decide what your risks are of doing business with a drug trafficker or a terrorist or a potential war criminal.
All right, so while we're giving a last couple minutes for questions to come in, Ann, do you think you could just give us the 1 to 2 biggest takeaways that you could give everyone for this presentation?
Okay, I think the most important thing that you have to be aware of is that regulators are looking for you to be compliant, and they're looking for it in ways that are more sophisticated than ever before, and your risks of being found to be non-compliant, if you're non-compliant, are greater than ever. And so it's important more than ever before to build an adequate compliance structure. The good news is the regulators are giving a lot of really good guidance, and a lot of the guidance might be coming, from cases involving anti-money laundering sanctions or Foreign Practices Act sanctions. But if you think about compliance holistically, you can absolutely draw up your compliance program, drawing from the elements of all of the guidance that's being given by the regulators. And the important thing is when the regulator asks, comes knocking at your door, that you're able to demonstrate that you've done what you can do internally to be compliant, and that you're aware of the responsibilities that you face.
Okay, great. We've had another question that's come in here. The question is there a list of providers that offer services that assist with compliance? And if so, do they carry an accreditation that ensures compliance?
Oh, very, very interesting question. Absolutely there are providers. I mean, obviously my company helps people with their compliance, and it's almost impossible really to build a compliance structure without working with a law firm. So, the law firms that deal with probably your outside counsel is the first place that I would look. And then a lot of times they like to work with accounting firms, especially if there is a huge amount of transaction testing that needs to be done. And depending on the size of your organization, that will sort of steer you to the size of an accounting firm that you need. But as far as an accreditation that ensures compliance, I'm not sure that I know of that. I'm sure that I don't know of such a thing. I'm not sure such a thing exists. But I think that the way that you kind of get that seal that you're looking for is working with a reputable law firm.
All right. I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so I think that we're going to close the presentation down at this point. On behalf of Credit to Be, I'd like to thank Ann and Grant Thornton for taking the time out to present to all of you today, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us. If you guys wouldn't mind, it would be great, again, if you could just fill out the survey that's at the end of the presentation. It takes about 20 seconds to fill out, and it gives us a lot of great feedback on what we can do to better these webinars for everyone moving forward. So with that, I'm going to end the presentation, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.